Next, Colonel Newsham. Okay. Okay, here we go. I got 14:57 to go. Okay, now the topic of my presentation is Okinawa. Why not another Singapore? Now, when I first went to Okinawa in 1985, one thing I noticed was an excessive dependence on tourism and on subsidies for the bases. And the subsidies are so huge that I think they shape the base issue. But one thing I noticed is that despite these huge base subsidies, despite tourism, Okinawa had a stagnant economy. And young people had no choice, many young people had no choice, but once they grew up to leave Okinawa, sort of like in Ireland. So I was thinking about how do you fix the economy? How do you improve it? Thinking about this, Singapore comes immediately to mind. When Singapore got independence in 1965, it was a small island, no natural resources. It had been colonized. It had suffered the rapacious occupation by the Imperial Japanese Army. And about all it had left was military bases. And look what Prime Minister Lee did. And if anyone's been to Singapore, you know what I'm talking about. In the years since Singapore has done this, most Okinawa has kind of done this since independence. So how do you fix it? And I think Singapore is a very good model. Here is how I would argue the development plan that Okinawa should consider. And in fact, instead of sending people to Washington, D.C. to complain, sending people to Singapore to consult with the Singaporeans about how to make the most of what Okinawa has might be a very valuable thing to do. But here's the scheme. First, you create an environment that attracts business. Business is in business to make money. This is fundamental. And what I would suggest Okinawa needs is the freedom to make its own unique regulatory and incentive schemes to attract business. This includes very substantially reduced tax breaks for both Japanese and foreign companies. If it is as expensive to do business in Okinawa as it is in Kanagawa Prefecture next to Tokyo, well, nobody's going to come to Okinawa. So you make it worth business efforts. The U.S. South did the same thing, and that's why BMW and Mercedes have gone to South Carolina, have gone to Alabama. Second, identify what is Okinawa's comparative advantage. The reason the bases are on Okinawa is because of location, location, location. The same thing applies from a business standpoint for Okinawa. It's convenient for accessing the Asian markets. It's on the shipping routes. Additionally, compared to the neighbors, compared to China, China has no legal system, thoroughly corrupt. Intellectual property is not respected. There's no transparent and predictable business environment. Okinawa has all of this. Compared to Taiwan, someday Taiwan has a reckoning coming with China. How about Philippines? Corruption, crime, infrastructure problems, insurgency, and even still the Philippines has some pretty good high-tech manufacturing. Okinawa compares very well to the Philippines. The Republic of Korea, North Korea is not next door. There's nothing more to say. Okinawa looks good by comparison. Next, you would try to attract the right kind of investment. I would propose trying to get some light manufacturing and high-tech, the higher-end production, these higher-wage, higher-skilled jobs. And I would imagine there's some Taiwanese businessmen who would like to hedge their bets. Actually, in the mid-90s, the Taiwanese did make an effort to get into Okinawa, and they basically gave up in despair. The regulatory obstacles were too great. But that was in the 90s. Times have changed, and I think there is a way to attract those kinds of businessmen. You can overcome the comparatively high-cost environment in Japan by making use of Japanese manufacturing efficiency and productivity. Okinawa has a relatively well-educated and good workforce. You would have to do something to work on the education end a bit, but that can be done. And I get around Japan a lot. And if you can make computer chips in rural Kyushu assemble flat panel displays in Honshu, rural Honshu. There's no reason you can't do this in Okinawa. Additionally, service industries are a possibility. One that comes immediately to mind is Federal Express. You may remember when FedEx thought about going to Okinawa, and instead they went to Subic Bay. There's a reason why they went to Subic Bay, because Okinawa was not attractive enough. Once again, times change. And Okinawa's location and infrastructure is perfect for a regional hub for certain businesses. And here's where Okinawa's small size is actually an advantage, is that a few successes go a very long way. And I say the size is actually an advantage. But one thing, and I'll stress this here, that when you're trying to develop an economy, the leaders need to look out 2 and 3 generations and ask yourself, what can we do that is going to keep our young people on the island? Instead of having to go elsewhere. I think Hawaii might ask the same thing. But that is important. And real leaders, visionaries like President Lee of Singapore, they looked out several generations. And if they're not doing that, then they're not doing their jobs. The next thing, regenerate and expand tourism. This is an important and essential pillar to a good diversified Okinawan economy. But it's, and you want to make Okinawa a place where, 1, people want to go in the first place, and 2, they want to go back again in the future. One of the problems that's gotten slightly better is that Okinawa has always been too expensive to get there, and once you're there, it's cost too much. Who would go to Bali? Why would you go to Okinawa if you could go to Bali or even to London for the same price? Last year I went from Naha down to Yonaguni, and it cost me about as much as it would have if I had gotten an HIS discount ticket to go to Copenhagen. And it's only about 200 miles. So that needs work done, but it can be done. The outer islands in particular, if you've ever been to those, there's an atmosphere that is like nowhere else in Asia. And it is so unique, so distinct, that with the right development scheme, you could attract tourists from all over Asia, and I would submit all over the world to those places. Next, don't get sucked into faddish projects. I often hear of these silver bullets or magic fixes. I can go down the list. The FTZ, the Foreign Trade Zone. Well, that hasn't really turned things around. There's also talk of making the Okinawa like a Cayman Islands. Well, this is great if you're a shady accountant and want to promote the money laundering business. How about casinos? Once again, I would like to think that, well, the Yakuza would love it. But I would like to think that young Okinawans, it'd be good if we develop some Bill Gateses rather than guys who become blackjack dealers. The casino is not in itself a solution. The second runway at Naha Airport. This is good, but I would like to see a concrete, detailed assessment of the economic benefits that will bring. If it's, one might say, well, if you're going to make a second one, why not make a third and a fourth? There has to be some reason for actually building the runway. And just as I said, there's reasons, but explain it and publicize this. That would be very effective. Another thing I often hear is that, well, instead of these bases, what we need are mansions and shops. We'll make condominiums and shops. Okay, but what kind of jobs do these produce? What sort of management opportunities do these provide? What sort of education is actually required for these sorts of jobs? What are the wage levels? What do people get paid if you work in a shop or if you're a building manager or something like that? These are all good things, but you have to put them together in a coherent, systematic scheme. The next thing, the OIS, the Institute of Science and Technology up near Henoko. I'd like to see the plan that tells how this is going to pay for itself. I think the sequence might have been gotten wrong. It's a good public works project if you're a construction company, but often if you can get some business in place first, then the R&D, the research, follows a little better. But once again, there's no magic bullets to this, but it does take a comprehensive, systematic scheme. Next, you promote what is unique about Okinawa's human capital. I think more than any other people in Japan, the Okinawans are comfortable dealing with foreigners. Now, one thing I often hear is that, well, these are island people. You don't understand. They're lazy. They don't want to work hard. Well, this is absolute nonsense. Okinawans used to trade. They used to sail around Asia when it was actually dangerous to do this. They're traders, for goodness sakes, and they still are. And those are the savviest businessmen you will ever find. But I hear this all the time. And it often comes from Okinawans. But these are generally people who, in English, have got theirs. They have a good government job. They're in politics. They're academics. And they can afford to say this, but I would like to see them say, okay, well, I'll do this job and I'll handle the baggage at a hotel for a year, making minimum wage. They might change their mind a little bit, but the point of this is Okinawan's human capital is unique, and it is absolutely invaluable for building this economy. Next, realize that the bases are an economic resource. They're one pillar of a diversified economy. You see this on the Kanto Plain, where there's four major bases that get along very well with the diversified private sector. You saw this morning the governor saying, well, please come to Hawaii. He realizes the economic benefits of this. It's a steady, constant income, regardless of the economy. And the jobs on a base are generally fairly high-skilled, fairly high-paid, and these are genuinely globalized jobs. You're working in a multinational environment. And this is very good if you want to go elsewhere to work. I've heard, this was years ago, I heard a defense minister say, well, the bases are only 5% of our income. Well, one, I think that understates it. Take the bases away, and these huge subsidies presumably will be reduced considerably. But regardless of 5%, only a politician would stand in front and say, well, we'll give up 5% of our income. If a CEO did that in front of the shareholders and said, I gave up this secure 5% business, well, he would have a new job the next day. Now, so what I hope I've laid out is, very briefly, of course, is that I am very optimistic about what could be done with Okinawa's economy, and I really see the opportunity. And Singapore is a wonderful model for it, and the things I've laid out are exactly what Singapore has done. It does take some leadership to do this and some foresight. And once again, as I said, people who will look out 2 and 3 generations. And also, I would note in Singapore's case that it is possible to have business with also a very nice place to live, as anyone who's been there will know. And Okinawa can be the same thing. Now, I think that is indeed quite possible. So my advice is talk to the Singaporeans. Send the team down and talk to them. And put together a clear, comprehensive, just tangible development plan looking out into the future that you can hold up and say, this is how we're going to do it, rather than, oh, we have this burden and we're going to make casinos or free trade zones. Look at this comprehensively, and I think you'd be very optimistic, very surprised at what you can do. One other thing I'll just mention is I saw a statistic recently that there's supposed to be 22,000 people on Okinawa working in the IT industry. If you can find out where this IT industry is, please let me know. I think they may be mistaking like a salesman in a SoftBank shop for a computer designer. So there's a ways to go, but there's huge opportunities. But do say document it, make it concrete. I'm a little ahead of schedule because I talked fast. And what I would say is that since I have a little time, and tomorrow is March 11th, on March 11th, 2011, I was in Tokyo, and I thought I was going to die. I didn't. And the next day I got a call from the Marines saying, well, you're on active duty, go be useful. And what I did is I found myself in short order in Sendai, freezing to death, which was okay, because you had 20,000 people who, after that earthquake, had between 7 minutes and 2 hours to live. And then then they died. And there was nothing they could do about it. And that was a hell of a burden for those people. And the burden I have some perspective of this, and I would note it is ironic that it was a Marine, and there was a lot of others of us who headed immediately north, because that's where we wanted to be. It's not our country, yet that's what we did. And it was one of the most satisfying things I've ever done, but you also did get a very good sense of the resilience of the Japanese people. So that is something that one should keep in mind when you think about the U.S. Marines, the U.S. bases. But we were the ones who went to danger, and I'm not going to ask for a show of hands who else went up north shortly afterwards, because it would not be very many. But it was it was an honor to get to go. So it was very nice to get to talk to you, and I'm down to 10 seconds, so thank you very much. Not here.
David Nguyen could probably answer your question about where the 22,000 IT people are. Thank you very much, Colonel Newsham.